Joining me today is a very, very special guest. He is a Harvard-educated scholar and a pioneer in the worlds of community-led conservation and research throughout the Himalayan range. He has been decorated with the Order of the Golden Ark by Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, a very, very lofty acknowledgement in the world of wildlife conservation. And rather notably, he spent, I think, what was almost 30 years on the trail of the Yeti, which he researched and proved to actually be the Himalayan black bear, an interdisciplinary approach that was actually documented in a book he published in 2017 called Yeti, the Ecology of a Mystery, and it was published by Oxford University Press. And I am doing no justice to this here, but there is truly something for everyone in this book, and I highly recommend you all read it. He is a true child of the Himalayas, both in the literal and metaphorical sense. And today, therefore, we have no one better to discuss protecting the Himalayan wild after debunking the Yeti. Dr. Daniel Taylor, thank you very much for your time. Please.
It's a huge pleasure to be with you all today. What a miracle and magic that we have in the online medium forum. When I was growing up in India, I came to India before independence, by the way. I was a 2-year-old.
Right.
And I had pigeons. And so when we wanted to communicate in those days, we tied messages to the pigeons. And we would send messages. Or we would look out the door and we would shout, "Faltu!" And somebody would come running and we would send a chit. But here we are today. I'm in the United States. You're in India or wherever. And we're sharing by electronically. Hold on, I apologize, but my computer battery needs some electrons. So it's like having to feed my pigeons years ago. I had to plug in the electrons to my computer. Anyway, it's a great pleasure. And as Ishan said, I grew up in the Himalaya. Let me just say, many of you may know where Landauer is. It's a suburb of Mussoorie in the Indian Himalaya. And I was 11 years old, and I was walking past the table, and I saw this picture on the front page of The Statesman, this wonderful newspaper, of course, it's published in Calcutta. And there was an article by the curator in the British Museum who said that this was the footprints of a langur monkey. Well, I had langurs all around my house in Mussoorie, and I knew for sure that this wasn't langur, and even if the snow was melting it. So I said, what is this? And so I began to search, and here's a picture of me at 11 years old on a Yeti search. This happens to be up in the Kulu Valley. And I just had the opportunity, because of my family, to be able to move extensively throughout the Himalaya. My father was a medical doctor. And my grandparents were as well. And so in the course of traveling extensively through the Himalaya, I went to a lot of the places where there were reports, not just verbal reports, but photographic reports of Yetis, with always the mystery evidence being the footprint. This is not an imaginary animal if it can make footprints. Right. And so I kept wondering what was making the footprints. Was it a hominoid, an abominable snowman, or was it some known animal, or was it an unknown animal? And there are many places in the Himalaya where you have footprint evidence. And this is one place in Nepal where there is a physical footprint in the ground that they claim this is in the rock of the Yeti. And so there is this persistent method of using science to follow a cultural idea. And that's what I was trying to do from my childhood onward. Because my parents and grandparents were scientists. And I realized that while there is truth in the local lore, there's also truth in science and how we put these together. And so as I went forward, here's a picture of taking my 2-year-old son into the jungle. This is the jungle of the Barun Valley on the slopes of Makalu, and some of you may remember a few years ago, the Indian Army tried to climb Makalu, and as they came off the mountain unsuccessfully, all of a sudden they found
Footprints.
Yeti prints at the base of Makalu, the Indian Army, no less. So I was contacted, and people said, Professor Taylor, you say the Yeti is not a wild hominoid, it's a bear. And I said, well, the last time we had footprints that were 1 meter long was when dinosaurs walked on the earth. So with all due respect to the Indian Army, I don't think we have dinosaurs on Makalu. So I kept searching where and what was going on. And in the course of this, I went into the Bhutan and Nepal and India and in the Karakorums in Pakistan. I had other reasons to be there. Because I'm also a mountaineer, but always was this, what is found making these mysterious footprints? And this is what we were finally able to conclude. That is at that time called Selenarctus tibetanis. Now it's called Ursus arctus tibetanis, but it's popularly known as the Himalayan black bear, Balu. And in Nepal, there became the mystery because the Nepali villagers said that they had two balu. One is Ruk balu, which is tree bear, and the other is Bhui balu, which is the ground bear. So the question is, why does this particular bear make human-like footprints? And the answer lies here that when it is in the tree bear form, which is a juvenile form, the inner digit, right down here where I'm pointing, drops down so that the bear has an opposable thumb, sort of like a primate. And then when it steps into the snow, that means what is normally a bear claw looks like a footprint with a thumb. And when the footprint of the hind foot goes on top, then you have here the front foot here, and then lo and behold, here the hind foot coming over, and you can see the claw, the nail mark of the hind foot here. So this is actually an overprint of the bear's front paw, and this is the thumb-like feature out here that makes it look like it's a human. And here's what makes it look from what is normally a round print into an elongated human-like footprint. So I'll just leave the screen here, and we'll go back and I can take any questions you might have.
So, in a way, you comprehensively relegated the Yeti to the world of the mythic wild, which you've written about in your book, which maybe not for the entire Himalayan range, but for at least Nepal for a while. It almost seemed like it was what the American bison is to the US, or the tiger is for India. However, since you've also written the snow leopard, speaking of danger to the wild, and as you know, it's come back from the brink of extinction and has become an very effective umbrella species across borders, both in the Indian Himalaya, Tibetan Plateau, Nepal, even Bhutan onwards. You've been involved with community-based interventions, as well as setting up protected areas in the Tibetan Plateau and Nepal as well. The snow leopard story and community-based conservation appear to be very strongly interlinked. So how much of a role do you think engagement with local communities has played in the snow leopard bouncing back?
Well, it's been huge. After we had the Yeti discovery, I had a personal friendship with the King of Nepal. We had gone to school together. You mentioned I went to Harvard, and so did His Majesty.
Right.
And because I knew Nepali, it was natural that a friendship we would chat in Nepali at Harvard Square. But the point that is relevant here is that with his encouragement, he said, don't just walk on stage and make a lot of money wearing Chewbacca suits from Star Wars and then show everybody where the zipper is. Because there's good money to be made, $2,000 a speech, okay?
Right.
But let's do something. And so in planning with him, because of my background with community work and my parents and my grandparents and so on and so forth, we said, let's create a national park around the Barun Valley, where we had done the discovery of the explanation of the Yeti. And this is adjacent to Sagarmatha National Park, which is on the Nepal side of Everest. It's contiguous, and it basically starts on the east slope of Everest, the Lhotse face, and it goes over to the Arun River.
Right.
So we started that. And in the course of that, because I was just a simple person with no money, I'm not the World Wildlife Fund. I happen to be president of the Mountain Institute, but don't have the financial resources of IUCN or WWF. So partly because it was the right thing to do, and partly it was because we could afford to, we said we're going to do a development project and a conservation project at the same time. So in 1981, there was a famous conference in Bali, Indonesia, that advocated for the Biosphere Reserve model, which was a core area and a buffer area. It's zonal management. And in the buffer area, you engage partnership with people. Well, we said, let's do the first application in Asia. And so the first application of the man and biosphere approach was in Makalu Barun in 1983, on to 1989 when it was finalized. And then, very interestingly, I said, snow leopards, they don't carry passports. Neither do musk deer.
Right.
Neither do balu. And so they cross the border all the time. So I had read the literature of what was on the other side. Tibet was a closed region of China. No outsiders were allowed. Through, as I described in my book, I won't repeat here, the book you mentioned, Yeti, The Ecology of the Mystery, that's published by Oxford. I opened contact with the Chinese government. They invited me in. We were the first international group there. Well, then I sat down with the governor of Tibet, who happened to be a man by the name of Hu Jintao. Hu Jintao later becomes president of China.
Right.
Very useful to be the first, as they say in Chinese, long nose, to work with the man who becomes president of China.
Right.
And what's relevant here is that he said, my purpose in the Chinese presence in Tibet is to engage the people of Tibet. This is the Communist Party. They're occupying the Tibet Autonomous Region.
Right.
And so we came up under his leadership with a participatory approach to conservation. And we set up a huge park on the Chinese, Tibetan side of Mount Everest, which is the size of Denmark, 3 times larger than Yellowstone in the United States. What's important about that is that in participation with the people, we said we needed some engagement with the most endangered things. So here's where we get to the snow leopard. So it's a little bit of a circle here that I'm using to come to your snow leopard point.
Right, right.
All my scientist friends, like Rodney Jackson and Peter Seligman and so on and so forth, George Schaller, for instance, who had spent a lot of time with snow leopard, were telling me to take the science approach. I said, no. The science approach will just have us document the animal. It won't engage in protection of the animal. And so we began dialogues with the Tibetan people in their villages about how they could respect the snow leopard and protect it. Respect and protect at the same time.
Right.
So we began the community participation approach that has now been adapted, very successful in Ladakh in India, for instance.
Right.
It's been adopted in Mongolia. It's been adopted throughout the Chinese region. It's been adopted in Nepal and Bhutan and on into northern Burma, in fact, Myanmar.
Right.
And that all began on the north slope of Mount Everest, Chomolungma, as they say in Tibetan,
Right.
because we said we're not going to try to protect the snow leopard only. We're going to protect the snow leopard and respect it within the culture and have the people benefit. And so the whole community engagement approach, where the people were the wardens, the people were not the bad guys.
Right.
The people obviously were protecting their flocks from being eaten. At that time, they were being offered gunpowder with dynamite caps by the military in China, so that when they would a snow leopard would attack their sheep, the snow leopard would come back to eat the sheep, and the snow leopard's head would be blown off.
Right.
And so then they would sell the skin to the military. The point is, how do you get their participation? And so how do you protect them? The animals, their domestic animals, as well as the wild animals. That all approach we described in the book.
Right.
It's been extremely successful, and it's now behind the advancements. The musk deer, wonderfully, is coming back in numbers.
Right.
The bear, the balu that I began my search with, is coming back in numbers because that was being killed as well for gallbladders.
Yes.
So this whole engagement of understanding that humans are not apart from the wild. We are a wild animal ourselves,
Right.
and we need to be managed as part of an ecosystem. The boundary of a park is the most artificial creation and problem in a park. The boundary should be penetrable. Pardon me, I'll just do one final little fun story. As I mentioned, when we were working in Tibet,
Right.
we were the first international group to be there. And so we had contacts with many people. So I was having dinner with the mayor of the city of Lhasa. And I said, you know, there's this fantastic wetlands right behind the Dalai Lama's Portala Palace. Fabulous wetlands, the black-necked crane comes here, all sorts of interesting things. And it extends all the way from the Portala Palace to Drepung Monastery, which is the largest monastery in the world with 10,000 monks. I said, let's create that into a park. And he said, oh, that's a wonderful idea. You're a rich American. You can pay $1 million a year and we'll create it into a park. I said, here's my wallet. You can see that there's only a little bit of money in it.
Right.
I said, but you can create the national park. You're the mayor. You will get the people of Lhasa to create the park. And he said, how did we do this? He said, I'm poor. I don't have a budget. That thousands of Chinese are coming to Lhasa all the time. And that's why I said, we have to do something before the thousands of Chinese make that into settlements.
Right.
So I said, you, instead of putting the fence like this, up and down, we'll put the fence like this, horizontal. And that fence is from your road budget, Mr. Mayor, that the Chinese government has given you. We will make a road that goes all around this wetlands. And you've got your fence, but it's not like this, it's like this. And on one side, you can say people won't build houses.
Right.
Okay. On the other side, they can build houses, but the taxes will go up because they will be paying higher taxes because they're looking at a nature preserve. And today, it is the largest urban park, national park in the world at 1,000 hectares. And there are high-rise apartment buildings all around it, just like there are in Central Park in New York City. I mean, and it's twice the size of Central Park. So the point is, there was a partnership, in this case with the government, with the people picking up the support costs, with international scientists giving advice. And that is what we have to do because we are all together on this planet. We can't create a wall between conservation and development. We have to be doing what years ago, it was the Indian informers in 1992 in the Stockholm Conference that introduced the term sustainable development. Manmohan Singh, the economist, was the man who wrote those words. And it's the idea of sustainable development.
Right. So coming to this point, actually, it's a good point. You reference a discussion in the Saldima Meadows in your book, where I believe it was John Craighead, if I'm not wrong, who contrasted the work you were doing, which was participatory in nature, versus what happened in Yellowstone National Park in the 1870s, which was, of course, the U.S. military comes in and kicks out the natives to create an inviolate reserve, presumably reduce anthropogenic pressure. Now, engaging local communities has been largely successful. In India, it's been in select cases with certain interventions. What do you think is necessary for the success of these partnerships?
Well, first of all, it's glad you brought up John Craigie. He's my guru. Right. He's taught me so much. He was the first person to put radio collars on wild animals, which he did on the grizzly bear. Then the first person to use satellites to monitor and track those, which he did up in Alaska. John Craig and his brother were just absolutely pioneers in getting new approaches to conservation.
Right.
And the point is, as you mentioned, when we created in the United States a wonderful idea, which is Yellowstone National Park, we had an employment problem, which we had the U.S. Cavalry, which was our professional military force that we used to hunt down the Native American population.
Right.
We call it cowboys and Indians and all these other stories of TV westerns. It's horrible. It's a crime. It's sin. But they were unemployed, so that the U.S. Park Service is the continuation of the U.S. Cavalry that was used to hunt down indigenous peoples. And the proof of that is look at their uniform. Of the U.S. Park Service today, it's the same as the cavalry in 1870. Okay? Smokey the Bear, our icon of protecting our national parks, is wearing a U.S. Cavalry uniform. Okay, but I could go there. You can tell that I get very angry about this.
Of course.
But what's important here, you mentioned the Indian experience. When I was a boy, driving in our Jeep around the UP, there were very few trees. When I will be coming to India next month, and I will be driving from Delhi to Haridwar for personal reasons, and I will see trees all along the road. It used to be that we only had trees along the Grand Trunk Road, GT Road.
Right.
Now you can see trees in every farmer's field, because the Indian government has made a policy decision that changed the policy decision of the British, which was that the trees belong to the government. The trees belong to the people. I'm oversimplifying, but you can see the proof of that. And as a consequence, you can see the proof of all sorts of other wildlife species adapting to the fact that when I was a boy in India, there was 1/3 the number of humans that there are today. And when my father was born in India in 1916, there was 1/5 the number of Indians there. My father, as a 6-year-old, was picked up from his cradle by a she-wolf. They were in a tent, and my father was being carried out of the tent because my grandparents were doing medical work in the jungle for villagers. And the ayah was woken up by the she-wolf lifting up my father at 6 weeks of age. And she took her topi and she patowed that she-wolf, and it dropped my father on the floor. That was a different India.
Right.
With 1/5, 20%, the people that are there today. But wildlife and people are both still there, whether it's the tiger, the snow leopard, or Homo sapiens, and we're both learning to live together.
Right.
I was so excited when I heard the tigers have come back to Missouri. I mean, there's only one last year, but it had 1950s was the last time we had a tiger in Missouri, and we have leopards in Delhi now, Mumbai.
Yeah. So there's an interesting point you've raised about urban leopards, tiger in Missouri. I'm going to take 2 examples where something similar happened, and I'd be curious to know what you think. Chitwan National Park in Nepal, and this Vidarbha landscape in Maharashtra, where I don't know if you've heard of the Tadoba and Dari Tiger Reserve. Both have a history of buffer zones or mixed use forests, as you would define. You know, where you have a core, and then of course there's a buffer where there is cover, but there's also mixed use. Since these areas have come up, there also appears to be, in correlation, a dramatic increase in human-wildlife conflict. And this is tigers, specifically the example of tigers killing people, both in Chitwan and in the Vidarbha landscape. Some of this is predatory, some of this is under other circumstances. Have you had a similar experience when it comes to bears in the Himalayas? And what do you think of this phenomenon? And how can we best mitigate something like this?
Well, when somebody invades my home some chore, some thief walks in the door. I have every right to defend my home.
Of course.
I'm sorry. When a human being walks into my jungle, if I'm a tiger, I've got some rights. And if I don't have enough food and the human being tastes good, at least from the tiger's standpoint, it's understandable. I have a very dear friend whose face was taken off by a Himalayan black bear. Himalayan black bears there's something, they don't kill outright. They pull the face off of people. They just take the whole face and you down to the skull. This person's alive today. Okay. His face was stitched back on by my Uncle John, whom you know for the story on the caracal and so on and so forth. He's a dentist and he stitched this person's face back on. But the point is that the animals are protecting their habitat. They're trying to find their food, so that there is that side of all of this.
Right.
But on the other hand, the responsibility that we have as people is to create management plans. And this is where you're correct by talking about buffer zones that give a transition where the more strict wild can interact with the human thing, and learning how to create the management principles and the regulations will only happen through research and experimentation. What is correct for Madhya Pradesh is going to be different for the Uttar Pradesh.
Right.
Okay. And it's going to be different for the Chinese provinces of Tibet. And we need to experiment in these buffer zones about what works with local values and the wildlife's values. And that requires a role of science, such as the work that you do, which is precisely in this area of trying to do research so that we can continually learn, because we are a learning species.
Right.
We know more today as human beings, thanks to research such as the work you lead, and all the fabulous work that's been done on the tiger.
Sure. So on that note, and then this almost seemed to be juxtaposed in your book, and I think it was in reference to the Barun Valley. You talk about looking for an old, pristine wild and going to a part of the valley that was only to find old smugglers' route leading out to Tibet. So does a truly inviolate habitat, I mean, is it a construct? Is it to be found anywhere in the Himalayas? Or even is it even possible in the Asian landmass?
Inviolate by the human species? No, of course not, because we have climate change.
Right.
That has changed the very dynamics of the biosphere. So even if you put a fence around things, you would be still seeing trees walking uphill. Okay. And when the trees walk uphill, the birds go with them and the insects as well. And as the trees are walking uphill, it's because of a warming climate and the glaciers are melting, so the water resources are getting less. So even if you put a boundary, physical boundary around, because the whole world is one, and because the industrial world, led by the industrial expansion of first Great Britain and then North America and now China and everybody else, is fundamentally altering the planet, the inviolate has been violated. It has been profoundly violated. It's been raped. And we are the cause. And our children and grandchildren will take the punishment for what we have caused. The violations will continue, and the violations are soon going to be on the human species. Now, that was not your question. I have taken your question and jumped beyond it. And this relates into my point of bioresilience and some other points. But the point that I want to make is that in the Barun Valley, in the 1980s, there were whole valley sections that, to the best of my knowledge, At most, it had some shikari walking through that had been a passenger. But even today, there's a trail. It's called the Yeti Trail. I've been responsible for making it. That goes right through the length of the Barun Valley so that people can see this most wild valley in the whole Himalayan system. There's one other valley in Bhutan that could be claimed to be equally wild
Right.
in the balance, but there's none in India. And as I say, there's one in Nepal, and the only reason why the Barun's still wild in Nepal is because there's so much rain that even the Nepalis don't want to go in there. And the reason that there's so much rain is because when you look at Everest, Chomolungma, Sagarmatha, whatever you want to call it,
Right.
Makalu, number 5, Lhotse, number 4, they create a little cirque, a little cup that sticks up into the jet stream of the Earth. So when the jet stream goes over top, it creates a sucking over this little cup. And that pulls warm air up the Arun River, which is the only river in the whole Himalaya to go straight through the Himalaya. There's no turns. It's straight because the Arun predates the Himalaya. It's more than 50 million years old. So it's a pipe that goes from India to China. And then there's a side pipe that's called the Barun Valley.
Right.
And the sucking up at the top from these number 1, number 4, number 5 highest, as the jet streams putting pressure on the top, brings warm air up the Arun from India, up the Barun. It meets the cold air and it rains. So there's a microclimate there that is absolutely unique in the world. And that's why it's so wet. And when it's so wet, there's so much jungle.
Right. At that altitude, too. I mean,
I mean, it's just, from a biologist standpoint, it's fabulous.
Right. Yeah. So actually, segueing off that and coming back to another subject in your book, dealing with black bears, obviously. Bioresilience, which is what I found a truly fascinating concept in your book, where you've talked about it complementing the diversity of species or biodiversity, whereas bioresilience, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, refers to the resilience of a particular species. However, biodiversity is still considered a key indicator as far as ecosystem health is concerned across landscapes. Why do you think this might be flawed? And how did your time in the Himalayas shape your understanding of what you call bioresilience?
Well, I would love for somebody who's listening to you and me having this conversation to contact me. Please. My email is daniel@future.edu. Daniel, Daniel @future.edu if they want to talk more about this subject.
Right.
Because I don't have the time to study it.
Right.
And I would like some colleagues that I can work with. I'm an old man. I've got other responsibilities. I happen to lead a university. But here's the point. Biodiversity is real.
Yeah.
The greater the number of species, the more vibrant the ecosystem. Okay, if you've got 1,000 species versus 10 species or 100 species, it makes the ecosystem stronger. So E.O. Wilson and Lovejoy, all these people who talk about biodiversity, they're correct.
Right.
But I noticed something, as you say, because I spent time in the Himalaya. As you walk up a mountain in the Himalaya, the species get fewer. But do not try to tell me that those few species, like the gentian flower, that is living so high, is weak. Those gentian flowers are hardy. They can be blooming and it can be freezing, below freezing temperature. And the petals don't die. You know, don't tell me that the Himalayan pika is a weak animal. That Himalayan pika that lives in the hole way down is a very strong animal. It does not need 16 other species on the mammalian forms to fill the eco niche of the high altitudes. Because where with biodiversity, it takes many species to fill many niches. The idea that I have proposed, and I created the name bioresilience, is that one species can fill many niches. So instead of needing 16 or 32 species to fill 16 niches, ecotones, whatever you want to call them, one species can cross all of those. And the most dramatic example of that is human beings, which can live underwater if we have a tube that goes up, and we can live out in outer space if we have a tube that brings the air from down in the earth. We can live anywhere.
Right.
And the problem of living anywhere is that we're destroying everywhere.
Right.
So we are the most resilient species. But imagine how resilient is the Indian crow. I mean, just look at the habitats that those crows live in.
Right.
They're showing bioresilience, is my example. These individual species are able to occupy multiple niches because why? And this is my point, adaptation. If we are going to have life to survive the catastrophe of the Anthropocene, where the human species has brought this plague on the planet, if life itself, not we, but if all life is to survive, all life will need to adapt. And some of that adaptation will be individual species expanding in their bioresilience, their ability to live in new niches. But those of us who do have that capacity need to protect and create habitats for those who cannot adapt. And that's called nature preserves. And we need to keep these seeds, like a farmer keeps the seed for the next year. We need to keep this genetic material, whether it's the snow leopard or the clouded leopard, which is, I think, less known and equally interesting as an animal, and of course the spotted leopard, and of course the caracal, and all these other things. Because, in the world that's coming, we need all the help we can get.
It's interesting you discussed this. I think by your reckoning, and correct me if I'm not wrong, you discussed bioresilience also in connection to bears in the Himalayas and black bears, Himalayan black bears specifically. In the communication with me, you were saying that all bears in the Himalayas are endangered today. What would you, and this, maybe I'm incorrect on this, but this would be perhaps at variance with the IUCN status, according to the species.
Well, in my personal experience,
yeah,
we have Melanursus, the sloth bear.
Right.
I see fewer of those than I used to.
Right.
And the reason, of course, is habitat. And then in the Indian context, there's really only two other bears. One is the brown bear up in Kashmir, the Ursus arctos isabellensis,
right,
or pruinensis, if you want to, depending, there's some debate over the subspecies.
Right.
And then there's, of course, the black bear, which we used to have in a separate genus, Selenarctos, but then now it's been put into the Ursus arctos.
Right.
Betanus is the species.
Right.
But there are others. Of course, there's the sun bear, which comes very close to India. It doesn't enter in Assam or Arunachal, but it's close.
Yeah.
And then there's obviously the blue bear. And years ago, my family were the first Americans to be invited into Bhutan in 1961. My father did the first formal health survey of Bhutan.
Right.
And at that time, I became friends with the king of Bhutan. I was 16 years old, and we were staying at the palace. And I talked to him about bears because I was interested in the Yeti. And I said to him, Your Majesty, what is this Yeti thing? And of course, he was interested because the Yeti is part of Bhutanese legend. And so he said, well, actually, the animal, I think, is the blue bear. And he was aware that the blue bear, which is Ursus arctos pruinensis, was coming into Bhutan, and that was the story. Well, the blue bear is a very interesting bear. And when I was with John Craighead, when we were studying in northern Tibet, because we've now done a number of national parks in the Tibet Autonomous Region, when we began, there was zero percentage of Tibet was protected. Now it's 54%. 18 nature preserves in Tibet, protecting more than half the land. But one of them's in the north. And there we came across the blue bear. And it's an extraordinary bear because it has massive shoulders, just huge, and a very short torso in its back. It's basically very similar to the Kashmir red bear, brown bear, whatever you want to call it. And the reason is that up there, there's no trees or meaningful vegetation. So this bear has developed a unique physique that allows it to lift over rocks and dig down into the holes to find the marmots and pikas to eat. So, but all these bears, to the best of my knowledge, have their numbers declining now, with the exception of the Himalayan black bear, which is slowly coming back because the market for the bear's gallbladder in China has been effectively diminished. I wouldn't say closed, but it's probably 80%. There's still some very tragic bear farms where they keep hundreds of bears in cages in order to milk their gall. Brutal, cruel down in Sydney. But most of the bear numbers, including, I'm particularly worried about melanosis, and I have not seen any recent scientific evidence on it. You may have it about the Indian sloth bear, but I think that is declining.
It varies by landscape, but I'll be happy to share some
good
literature with you aside from this conversation. So, but what would you attribute? So, you use the term endangered. So, how? I mean, so do you feel if you were to use, I guess, extinction as some kind of ceiling, perhaps, at least when it comes to the Himalayas, which species are sort of under more threat than others?
Well, the ones that live in very tight niches. I mean, you take something like the white-bellied heron in Bhutan. You know, some of these birds live in very tight niches and they don't have the capacity to adapt. Mammals tend to be more adaptable, but I'm very worried about musk deer, for instance. Their feed range, they like the usnea moss, the lichen, and with the diminishing of pristine habitat. Pristine, of course, is a bad word in its own. You know, you used the word inviolate earlier. We don't really have the language for responsible science anymore because we've so romanticized so many words.
Yes.
But we do have some real threats to megafauna and to avian fauna, and of course, in the waterborne animals. I showed you before this began the gharial crocodile that's right around the corner here,
Right.
and that was almost completely gone, and that is coming back, but it's very fragile, and it's because of the water quality, you know. And as more and more people are more desperate for water, that the whole dynamic of water on the planet. I mean, when I was a boy in the Punjab in the 1950s, and I used to see 500 black buck running across the plain, you know, with a wonderful secunda grass, and just it was gorgeous in the 1950s. But now, with all those hardworking Punjabi farmers, the water's gone. You know, the deep wells have taken in the Punjab, which means 5 rivers. I mean, those 5 rivers are almost empty. And the water table's down. And that means we have a real question about the core substance that humans need to live. We can't live without water. And so not only ourselves, not only the gharials, but every animal that's dependent on water has got a big question mark over its future.
And actually, coming back to that point, I mean, when we talk about the Himalayas today, much of the discourse is now connected to climate change, melting glaciers, the fate of river basins, etc. When it comes to, I guess you could even connect it somewhat with habitat destruction in certain areas. What, in your opinion, today is the most potent threat to ecosystems across the Himalayan range? Does it vary by landscape and nation, or do you think there is some uniformity in some of the problems?
Well, first of all, let me just say one of the enjoyable topics that I love to get into arguments about is the melting of glaciers. Because I know from having walked in the Himalaya that most of the water in the rivers of the Himalaya does not come from glaciers, maybe 10%. Most of the water in the Himalaya comes from the water reserves that are in the biomass on top of the earth. So that when it rains, that works as a sponge and that absorbs the water and it creates the springs that form into the soil, and that feeds the river. So if you do a water analysis on the Ganga or on the Brahmaputra or anything, yes, there is some glacial water in there, but most of it is water that has fallen in the valleys, that has been absorbed in the forests and in the fields and is percolating out because of the Himalaya. And that's what created that wonderful habitat that we call the Terai that used to be around Haridwar, goes up to Nepal, goes up to Bhutan. It's the foothills below the arc. Yeah, it's an arc, and that was created because the Himalayan range created the sponge at the bottom of the mountains that became the true water source that allowed the Indian civilization to flourish.
Right.
And we don't realize that it was the Himalayas that caught the water, that put it down there at the foot of the mountains, and that water then nourished this 5 millennia of civilization that is India today. And what's so special about the Himalaya, of course, is that they're the only part of the planet that sticks up into the jet stream. So it's catching the moisture, not just from the Bay of Bengal in the monsoon, but it's catching all the wind that circles the planet. Now, your question, I wasn't answering your question, but the biggest threat. The biggest threat is human consumption. India, correctly, the people of India want a better life. There are 1.2 billion people. 1.2 billion people wanting a better life means that the planet is going to die. We need to come up with the sort of metaphysical understanding about what is happiness, what is fulfillment in life, which we do not have today. We need some sort of spiritual awakening. And going up to Kedarnath or some holy cave and sitting there and doing meditation, wonderful that might be, is not going to give us the sort of enlightenment that we need to go forward by changing our consumption patterns. Ultimately, population numbers are going down slowly. We can see that in the human reproduction. But they will not go down fast enough. What has to happen fast enough is changing our consumption. Now, that wasn't your question either. You didn't want some sort of metaphysical answer from some sort of living up in Kedarnath or Muktinath or someplace. But what we need to do, I think, is to look at what's working. We have to stop looking at what the problems are. And the university that I'm responsible for, it's called Future Generations University, and there's much more material. But we have a method that's called seed scale.
Okay.
And seed scale, and if people want more, it's seed scale, seed-scale.org on the web. There's a whole curriculum there. But that says 4 things. Number 1, we build from our successes. We don't worry about our needs. Everybody has a success, otherwise it'd be dead. So what's keeping us alive? Build from our successes. Number 2, we all have partnerships. Nobody's alone. How do we strengthen our partnerships? Don't try to strengthen our asset base, strengthen our partnerships. Okay, number 3, make decisions based on evidence. We all love to make decisions based on opinions. And we try to enforce our opinions by power. Look at every government in the world. Okay? But when we make evidence based on facts, we bring factions together. And number 4, the hope for all of us is in changing our behaviors. Everybody can change their behaviors. Everybody is equally wealthy in behavior change as Bill Gates. So when we build from our successes and we work through our partnerships and we work on from facts, not factions, then we will ultimately change our behaviors. And in changing our behaviors, we can address the point that I was making on called consumption.
Thank you very much, Dr. Taylor. Thank you very much for your time. This is most insightful. And Jai Hind.